The lawyer's voice echoed through the conference room like a judge delivering a death sentence. $150 million. The words hung in the air as my sister Victoria's face drained of all color, transforming from smug satisfaction to pure rage in seconds. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into Julian's arm as she lunged forward, screaming that our father couldn't have done this to her. But he had. Arthur Vance had just handed me the weapon to destroy everything Victoria had spent her entire life craving, and I was holding a contract that proved the worthless farm she'd mocked me with was worth more than her entire billion-dollar empire. If you want to know how a single piece of land can bring down a corporate queen and expose the man she loved as nothing more than a con artist, make sure you like this video. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below telling me what you would do if your family betrayed you like mine did. Because this story is about to get wild. Let me take you back to where it all started 6 months before that explosive revelation in Mr. Sterling's office. I had been living in a cramped studio apartment in downtown Denver, working double shifts at a medical supply company just to make ends meet. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then I got the call that changed everything. Dad had collapsed at the office. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe less. Victoria was in Milan for Fashion Week when it happened. She sent a text saying she'd fly back when she could, but her schedule was absolutely insane. I knew what that meant. I'd spent my entire life being the afterthought, while Victoria was the golden child, the heir apparent to Vance Industries, the daughter who got Dad's attention, his pride, his everything. So I did what I always did. I stepped up. I quit my job, gave up my apartment, and moved into Dad's sprawling estate in Cherry Hills Village to take care of him. For 5 months, I was there every single day. I managed his medications, coordinated with hospice nurses, held his hand through the bad nights when the pain was so intense he couldn't sleep. I read him the financial reports he was too weak to review himself. I listened to his stories about building the company from nothing, about Mom, about the early days when they had more dreams than money. Victoria visited exactly 4 times in those 5 months. Each visit lasted less than an hour. She'd sweep in wearing designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, check her phone constantly, and complain about traffic or some crisis at work that required her immediate attention. Dad would light up when she arrived, desperate for any scrap of her attention, and then deflate like a balloon when she left. It broke my heart every single time. During one of those visits about 3 weeks before Dad passed, I overheard her on the phone in the hallway. She was talking to Julian Kane, her boyfriend, and the corporate lawyer she'd been dating for 2 years. I'd never liked Julian. He had this calculated way of speaking, like every word was a chess move. But Victoria was obsessed with him. I heard her laugh, that sharp, brittle sound she made when she was being cruel. She said something about how she just needed to wait it out a little longer, that soon the company would be all hers, and they could finally make their move. At the time, I thought she was just being callous about Dad's illness. I had no idea she was talking about something far more sinister. Dad died on a Tuesday morning in March. He went peacefully, thank God. I was holding his hand. Victoria was in Aspen at a corporate retreat. She made it back in time for the funeral 3 days later. The funeral was a spectacle. Half of Denver's business elite turned out to pay their respects. Victoria played the grieving daughter, perfectly dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, accepting condolences with just the right amount of dignified sorrow. Julian stood beside her like a dark shadow, his hand possessively on her lower back. I stood alone on the other side of the grave, exhausted and hollow. A few people offered their sympathies, but most gravitated toward Victoria. She was the important one after all, the one who mattered. After the service, Mr. Sterling, Dad's longtime attorney, approached me quietly. He was an older man with kind eyes and silver hair, someone Dad had trusted for over 30 years. He told me the reading of the will would take place the following Monday at his office downtown. His expression was carefully neutral, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. Or maybe it was anticipation. I couldn't tell. That week crawled by. I stayed at Dad's house, unable to face the reality of finding a new place to live, a new job, a new life. Victoria didn't visit once. She was too busy at Vance Industries headquarters, already acting like the CEO she assumed she'd become. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress, the nicest thing I owned. I took the bus downtown because my old car had died 2 months ago, and I hadn't had the money to fix it. I arrived at Mr. Sterling's office building, one of those sleek glass towers that seemed to touch the clouds, and rode the elevator to the 23rd floor. The reception area was all dark wood and leather, the kind of place that whispered old money and power. Victoria was already there, looking like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine in a cream Chanel suit. Julian sat beside her, his expression smug. They were holding hands, and I noticed the enormous diamond ring on her finger that definitely hadn't been there at the funeral. Victoria barely glanced at me when I walked in. She was too busy admiring her ring, tilting her hand to catch the light. Julian whispered something in her ear that made her smile, that sharp, satisfied smile of someone who's about to get exactly what they want. Mr. Sterling's assistant led us into the conference room. It was an imposing space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Denver and the Rocky Mountains beyond. A massive table dominated the room, and Mr. Sterling sat at the head of it, looking somehow older than he had at the funeral. We took our seats, Victoria and Julian on one side, me on the other. The distance between us felt like an ocean. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and began. He spoke about Dad's legacy, his accomplishments, his wishes for the future. Victoria tapped her manicured nails on the table impatiently. She didn't care about the preamble. She wanted to hear what she was getting. Finally, Mr. Sterling opened the primary will. His voice was steady as he read. To Victoria Vance, Arthur bequeathed the entirety of Vance Industries, including all assets, holdings, and operational control. The company was worth approximately $3.2 billion. Victoria's smile could have lit up the entire city. She squeezed Julian's hand and actually let out a little laugh of triumph. Julian looked pleased, like a cat that had just cornered a mouse. Then Mr. Sterling turned to me. His voice softened slightly, though I couldn't tell if it was pity or something else. To Ava Vance, Arthur bequeathed the Blackwood Ranch property in Fremont County, Colorado. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at Mr. Sterling, trying to process what I'd just heard. Blackwood Ranch. I barely remembered the place. Dad had bought it decades ago, some old property that had been in Mom's family. I'd been there once as a child. All I could recall was dust scrubland and a dilapidated barn. Victoria's laughter shattered the silence. It wasn't a polite chuckle or even a surprised giggle. It was a full mocking laugh that bounced off the walls and made my face burn with humiliation. She laughed so hard she had to dab at her eyes, though this time the tears were from amusement, not grief. She finally caught her breath enough to speak. Blackwood Ranch. Oh my God, Ava. Dad finally figured out exactly where you belong, with the dirt and the failure and the absolute middle of nowhere. She turned to Julian, still laughing. We should send her some overalls and a straw hat as a housewarming gift. Julian smirked. Maybe some chickens too. Every farm needs chickens. They both dissolved into laughter again. I sat frozen, feeling like I'd been slapped. 5 months of caring for our father, of sacrificing everything, and this was my reward. A worthless piece of land, while Victoria got everything. Mr. Sterling's expression remained neutral, but I caught something flicker in his eyes. He adjusted his glasses and said quietly, "If I may continue." Victoria waved her hand dismissively, still grinning. "Oh, please continue. I want to hear all about Ava's fabulous inheritance." She leaned over and kissed Julian's cheek. "We're celebrating tonight, baby. Champagne at the Brown Palace." But Mr. Sterling wasn't smiling. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another envelope. This one was sealed with red wax, and the seal bore Dad's initials. There is one additional document. An addendum to the will executed 1 month before Arthur's passing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian's smirk faltered slightly. Victoria's laughter died in her throat. What addendum? Mr. Sterling broke the seal carefully and unfolded the papers inside. He glanced at me, and this time I was certain I saw something in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or vindication. This addendum pertains specifically to the Blackwood Ranch property. He began to read, and with every word I felt the world shift beneath my feet. The mineral rights to all land beneath and within the Blackwood Ranch property have been secured under an exclusive 50-year extraction contract with TerraCore Minerals, a subsidiary of Global Energy Solutions. Geological surveys completed in January of this year have confirmed the presence of one of the largest and purest lithium deposits in North America. Lithium, as you may know, is critical for battery production and electric vehicle technology. The contract provides an upfront payment to the property owner, Ava Vance, in the amount of $150 million plus 15% of net annual profits in perpetuity. The words hit like bombs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. $150 million. Lithium, the future of technology. The words swirled in my head, but wouldn't arrange themselves into anything that made sense. Victoria's face had gone from flushed with laughter to white as paper. She stood up so abruptly her chair fell backward with a crash. "That's not possible. You're lying." Mr. Sterling continued calmly pulling out another document. The contract was signed and notarized 6 weeks ago. The initial payment has already been deposited into an escrow account pending the formal reading of the will. As of this moment, Miss Ava Vance is the sole owner of property containing mineral resources valued at over $2 billion. Julian's hand shot out, grabbing Victoria's wrist before she could lunge across the table. His face had gone hard calculating. He was already trying to figure out the angles I could see it. This can't be legal. Arthur Vance wasn't of sound mind in his final weeks. Mr. Sterling fixed him with a cold stare. Mr. Vance was examined by 3 independent physicians at the time of signing. All confirmed his full mental capacity. The addendum is ironclad. But there's more. He pulled out 2 letters each in Dad's handwriting. One was addressed to Victoria, the other to me. His hands trembled slightly as he held them. Arthur asked me to read these aloud. He opened Victoria's letter first. The paper rustled in the heavy silence. "My dearest Victoria, I give you Vance Industries because I know it is what you have always wanted. Power, prestige, control. I have watched you hunger for it your entire life, but I want to see what you will do with it. Will you build something greater than I ever could? Will you honor the Vance name and the thousands of people who depend on our company for their livelihoods, or will you tear it all down in your pursuit of more? A legacy is not measured in dollars or market share. It is measured in how we treat those who cannot benefit us in the choices we make when no one is watching in the kind of world we leave behind. I pray you choose wisely. Do not disappoint me, daughter." Victoria's hands were shaking. Her perfect composure had cracked, and underneath was something raw and ugly. Rage, shame, fear. Mr. Sterling opened my letter and his voice softened again. "My darling Ava, I give you this land because you have your mother's heart. Eleanor loved Blackwood Ranch. It was her sanctuary, the place where she felt most at peace. You have her kindness, her patience, her ability to see value where others see waste. I watched you care for me these past months, asking nothing in return, expecting nothing. That is who you are. You know the meaning of sacrifice. You understand that true wealth is not in what we take, but in what we give. This land will provide for you, but more importantly, it will allow you to provide for others. Use it well. Build something beautiful. Make me proud. I always have been, sweet girl. I love you." Tears were streaming down my face by the time he finished. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to hold back the sobs. Dad had seen me. He'd understood. All those nights I'd thought he was barely conscious, he'd been watching, listening, knowing. Victoria's voice came out as a strangled scream. "This is fraud. This is manipulation. He was dying and confused, and someone poisoned his mind against me." She whirled on me, her face twisted with hatred. "You did this. You manipulated him while he was weak. You're a conniving little bitch." I stood up slowly, wiping my tears away. For the first time in my life, I looked my sister directly in the eye without flinching. "I didn't do anything except take care of our father while you were too busy to bother. He made his own choices, Victoria. Maybe if you'd been there, things would be different." She lunged at me, then actually lunged, her hands reaching for my throat, or the letter, or maybe just something to break. Julian caught her around the waist, hauling her back. "Victoria, stop. This isn't helping." She struggled against him, spitting venom. "This isn't over. Do you hear me, Ava? This isn't over. I will fight this. I will take you to court. I will destroy you." Mr. Sterling stood, his voice firm. "Miss Vance, I strongly advise you to consult with your own attorney before taking any action. This will is legally sound. Any challenge will be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. Your father knew exactly what he was doing." Julian finally managed to pull Victoria toward the door. She was crying now, makeup running down her face, her perfect facade shattered. As they reached the doorway, she turned back one last time. Her voice was cold and full of promise. "You haven't won anything, Ava. You're about to find out what it means to go to war with me. And trust me, little sister, you're going to lose everything." The door slammed behind them. The silence that followed was absolute. I sank back into my chair, my whole body shaking. Mr. Sterling poured me a glass of water from the pitcher on the table and slid it across to me. He sat down with a heavy sigh. "I have been Arthur's attorney for 32 years. I watched you girls grow up. I watched your mother die and saw how it changed everything in your family." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father knew exactly what would happen today. He knew Victoria would react this way, and he knew you would need support." He pushed a business card across the table. "This is Rebecca Chen. She's the chief legal counsel for TerraCore Minerals. She's expecting your call. She and her team will help you navigate what comes next because Victoria was right about one thing. This is about to become a war." I picked up the card with numb fingers. Mr. Sterling wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know. Your father updated his will multiple times over the years. 5 years ago, Victoria was set to inherit everything, including Blackwood Ranch. But after your mother died, after he saw how Victoria changed, how she became more focused on status than substance, he started making adjustments. The final addendum, the one about the lithium, he added that after his diagnosis. He spent his last months ensuring you would be taken care of." "Why didn't he just split everything evenly?" My voice came out hoarse. Mr. Sterling smiled sadly. "Because he knew that wouldn't teach either of you anything. Victoria needed to face the responsibility of running the company without safety nets. And you needed to learn your own worth to understand that you deserve good things, not because you fight for scraps, but because you are valuable. He believed this would push both of you to become who you were meant to be." I left the office in a daze. The spring sunlight felt too bright, the sounds of traffic too loud. I stood on the sidewalk outside the building, clutching my purse and the papers Mr. Sterling had given me, including the contract with TerraCore Minerals. $150 million. The number kept echoing in my head, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real. I called Rebecca Chen from a coffee shop 2 blocks away. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional, but not unkind. She'd been briefed on the situation and was ready to move forward. We set up a meeting for the following morning. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel near the airport. I couldn't go back to Dad's house. It didn't feel like mine, and I couldn't face the memories. I lay awake in the dark, listening to planes take off overhead, and tried to process everything that had happened. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to run, and I wasn't going to let Victoria intimidate me into giving up what Dad had left me. The meeting with Rebecca Chen changed everything. She was a sharp woman in her 40s, with steel-gray eyes and an air of absolute competence. Her office in the Denver Tech Center was modern and efficient, and she got straight to business. "TerraCore Minerals had been working with your father for over a year," she explained, pulling up geological surveys on her computer screen. "The lithium deposit under Blackwood Ranch is extraordinary. High purity, easily accessible, and massive. We're talking about a resource that could supply a significant portion of North America's lithium needs for decades." She walked me through the contract. The $150 million was just the beginning. The 15% of net profits could potentially be worth hundreds of millions more over the life of the contract. But there was more. "Your father inserted several clauses that protect you specifically," Rebecca continued. "First, TerraCore maintains all mineral rights and handles all extraction operations. You don't have to do anything except own the land. Second, there's an environmental protection requirement. We must maintain the surface land in good condition and restore it fully after extraction is complete. Third, and this was Arthur's specific addition, you have the right to use the surface land for any purpose that doesn't interfere with our operations. Agriculture, conservation, development, whatever you choose." "Why would Dad add that?" Rebecca smiled. "Because he knew you. He told me you had your mother's vision. He wanted to make sure you had the freedom to build something meaningful." Over the next 2 weeks, as the money transferred from escrow into my accounts, Victoria launched her first attack. Julian filed a lawsuit claiming Dad had been mentally incompetent. They found a doctor who'd treated Dad 3 years earlier to testify that he'd shown signs of cognitive decline, even back then. Rebecca and her team demolished the case in less than a month. They produced the 3 independent psychiatric evaluations Dad had undergone specifically to prevent this kind of challenge. They showed evidence that Dad had been lucid and strategic right up until his final days. The judge dismissed the suit and ordered Victoria to pay my legal fees. But Victoria wasn't done. She couldn't attack the will directly, so she attacked me instead. She used her position at Vance Industries to make my life hell in other ways. First, she leveraged the company's influence in Fremont County, where Blackwood Ranch was located. Vance Industries had contracts with most of the major construction firms and suppliers in Colorado. Victoria sent out word that anyone who did business with me would lose their contracts with Vance Industries. I found out when the contractor I'd hired to start renovating the ranch house called to cancel. He was apologetic but firm. I can't afford to lose Vance Industries as a client. I'm sorry, Miss Vance, but I have employees to think about. It happened again and again. Suppliers refused to deliver materials. Electricians and plumbers backed out of scheduled work. Even the local hardware store stopped taking my calls. Victoria was trying to isolate me to make it impossible for me to do anything with the property. She wanted me to give up to sell the land to her for pennies on the dollar just to escape the harassment. Instead, I drove out to Blackwood Ranch myself for the first time since I was a child. It was a 3-hour drive into the mountains, the kind of journey that took you far from civilization and cell phone towers. The road turned from highway to county road to dirt track. When I finally pulled up to the property, my rental car coughing dust, I understood why Victoria had laughed. The ranch was a disaster. The house was a weathered 2-story structure with peeling paint and half the shutters missing. The barn was leaning at a dangerous angle. The fences were down. The land stretched out in all directions, scrubby and brown, dotted with sagebrush, and not much else. It looked like the end of the earth. I sat in the car for a long time, looking at the ruin of the place. Then I noticed something. Beyond the sad buildings, beyond the overgrown yard, the land rolled away toward the mountains. And in the late afternoon light, it was beautiful. Raw and harsh and real, but beautiful. I got out of the car. The wind hit me immediately, carrying the scent of sage and earth and something clean and wild. I walked toward the house, and that's when I heard a voice. I figured you'd show up eventually. I spun around. An older man was standing by the barn. A man I hadn't seen there a moment ago. He was probably in his 70s, lean and weathered like the landscape itself, with white hair under a battered cowboy hat. Who are you? Caleb Morrison. I was the foreman here back when your mother was alive. Been looking after the place ever since, even though nobody asked me to. My throat tightened. You knew my mother. His weathered face softened. Eleanor was a fine woman. She loved this place. Used to say it was the only spot on earth where she could hear herself think. He gestured at the property. It's gone to hell since she passed, I'll admit. But the bones are good, the land is good. Just needs someone who cares enough to bring it back. Over the next hour, Caleb showed me around the property. He pointed out where Mom had wanted to plant an orchard, where she'd dreamed of building a stable where she'd sit and watch the sunset. He told me stories about her I'd never heard, about how she'd drive up from Denver every few weeks just to spend a day or two in silence, breathing the mountain air. By the time the sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple, I'd made another decision. I was going to restore Blackwood Ranch. Not because of the lithium money, but because of Mom. Because Dad had trusted me to do something meaningful. Because Victoria had tried to make this place sound like a punishment, and I was going to turn it into a triumph. Caleb became my first ally. He knew the land, knew the county, and more importantly knew which contractors were independent enough not to care about Victoria's threats. He also knew which local ranchers were struggling, which families were about to lose their land to back taxes. That's when I had my second revelation. Victoria had been using Vance Industries to squeeze these people, buying up their land cheap when they couldn't pay their bills. She was consolidating power in the county, probably planning to develop it somehow. I called Rebecca Chen. Is there any restriction on what I can do with the upfront payment? As long as you maintain ownership of Blackwood Ranch, you can do whatever you want with the money. Why? Because I want to help people. The next week, I paid off the back taxes for 12 different families in Fremont County who were about to lose their ranches. The total cost was less than $3 million pocket change compared to what I'd received. But to these families, it was everything. Word spread fast. By the end of the month, I had the loyalty of half the county. These were people Victoria had tried to crush, and I'd given them a lifeline. More than that, I'd given them hope. The contractors started coming back. Not the big corporate firms that relied on Vance Industries, but the small, independent operators, the family businesses, the craftsmen who cared more about the work than the money. Slowly, Blackwood Ranch began to transform. But I wasn't done. I established the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Memorial Scholarship Fund with a $50 million endowment. It would provide full college scholarships to children of miners and energy workers throughout Colorado. The announcement made the front page of the Denver Post. The PR was brilliant, Rebecca told me with an approving smile. You're positioning yourself as the philanthropist while Victoria looks like the corporate shark. I wasn't doing it for PR, but I couldn't deny it was working. My approval ratings in the local community were skyrocketing while Victoria's were plummeting. And Victoria noticed. The attacks escalated. She sent surveyors onto my property at all hours, claiming they needed to verify the mineral boundaries. They'd show up at midnight with bright lights and loud machinery tearing up the land and frightening the horses Caleb and I had started boarding. She planted stories in the business press suggesting I'd manipulated Dad in his final days, that I was an opportunist who'd isolated him from his real family. Julian's name was all over those stories. He was feeding them to reporters using his connections to try and destroy my reputation. Then came the threats. Letters arrived at the ranch anonymous, but clearly from Victoria or her people. They suggested that accidents happened on remote properties, that people could get hurt, that I should consider selling while I still could. Caleb found me reading one of those letters in the kitchen of the ranch house, which we'd finally made livable. He sat down across from me, his calloused hands folded on the table. "Your sister's scared." I looked up, scared. "Wouldn't you be?" She spent her whole life building this image of herself as the powerful Vance daughter, the one who mattered. And now you're showing her up without even trying. You're doing exactly what your daddy hoped you would. You're being who you really are. While Victoria focused on me, she was neglecting Vance Industries. I heard about it through Rebecca, who had contacts in the business world. Victoria had fired 3 senior executives, all of them men, who'd been loyal to Dad for decades. She'd replaced them with Julian's friends, corporate raiders, who cared more about quick profits than sustainable growth. She was making risky acquisitions, trying to expand the company too fast. She was cutting corners on safety regulations, pushing back against environmental compliance, anything to boost the quarterly numbers and prove she was a strong leader. The board of directors was getting nervous. The stock price was fluctuating wildly, and investors were starting to ask questions. I got a call in late August from a man named Robert Thornton. He'd been Dad's right-hand man for 20 years before Victoria forced him into early retirement. We met at a quiet restaurant in Boulder, far from Victoria's eyes. Robert was in his 60s, distinguished and careful in the way of men who'd spent their lives in boardrooms. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Your father was my mentor and my friend. I owe him everything, and I'm watching Victoria destroy everything he built." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were financial documents, emails, memos. Evidence of Victoria's mismanagement, of Julian's conflicts of interest, of decisions that put profits ahead of people and long-term stability. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I think you might be the only person who can stop her." He leaned forward. "Arthur left you that ranch for a reason. He knew you'd use it to build something good, but he also knew that someday you might need to save the company itself. That's the real inheritance he left you. Not the lithium, the legacy." Over the next month, I studied those documents. I learned everything I could about Vance Industries, its structure, its vulnerabilities, its potential. And I started making moves. With Rebecca's help, I began quietly purchasing Vance Industries stock. The price had dropped after Victoria's disastrous first-quarter earnings report, which made it affordable even for someone who'd already spent money on scholarships and tax relief. I bought through shell companies, spreading the purchases out so no one would notice a pattern. I also started reaching out to the board members Robert had identified as being unhappy with Victoria's leadership. I didn't pitch them on anything. I just listened. Let them vent their frustrations. Built relationships. By October, I owned 8% of Vance Industries. Combined with the shares held by board members who were sympathetic to my father's original vision, I had influence. Not control, but influence. That's when Victoria made her fatal mistake. She started planning to take the company public, to do an IPO that would dilute the existing shares and flood the market with new stock. It would make her incredibly wealthy in the short term, but it would fundamentally change the nature of Vance Industries from a family company to a corporate entity driven purely by shareholder returns. The board hated the idea, but Victoria pushed forward anyway. She scheduled a shareholder meeting for November 15th to vote on the IPO proposal. Robert called me the day the meeting was announced. "This is it. This is your chance. If you're going to act, it has to be now." I drove to Blackwood Ranch and sat on the porch Mom had loved so much, watching the sun set over the mountains. Caleb came and sat beside me, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. "You're thinking about whether to fight," he said. It wasn't a question. "If I do this, everything changes. I can't just be the girl with the ranch anymore. I'll be in the middle of it all." Caleb nodded slowly. "Your mama used to say something. She'd say that the right thing is usually the hard thing, and the hard thing is usually worth doing." He looked at me with those clear eyes. "What would Eleanor want you to do?" I thought about Mom, about the stories Dad had told me during those long nights in his final months, about how she'd fought to keep Vance Industries ethical when it would have been easier to cut corners. about how she'd insisted on environmental protections and worker safety when other companies were racing to the bottom, about how she'd believed that business could be a force for good if people had the courage to make it so. I knew what Mom would want, and I knew what Dad had prepared me to do. The night before the shareholder meeting Victoria was celebrating. I knew because it was all over social media. She'd posted pictures from a party at a downtown penthouse, champagne glasses and designer dresses, and hashtags about new beginnings. Julian was in every photo, his arm around her waist, looking like he'd already won. What they didn't know was that their relationship was built on sand. Rebecca had been investigating Julian for weeks, and what she'd found was damning. Julian Kane wasn't just Victoria's boyfriend. He was a corporate spy. He'd been working with a rival company, Meridian Holdings, to engineer a hostile takeover of Vance Industries. The plan was simple and brutal. Get close to Victoria, encourage her worst impulses, help her run the company into the ground, tank the stock price. Then Meridian would swoop in with a buyout offer that the desperate board would have to accept. Victoria would be out, Julian would be rewarded, and Dad's legacy would be carved up and sold for parts. I'd wondered how Julian always seemed to know exactly what to say to Victoria, how to push her buttons, how to make her paranoid and aggressive. Now I knew. He'd been playing her from the beginning. The shareholder meeting was held in the conference center at Vance Industries headquarters, a gleaming tower of steel and glass in downtown Denver. I arrived early, dressed in a simple but elegant navy suit. Rebecca was with me, along with Robert Thornton and 3 other former executives who'd agreed to support our position. The conference room filled quickly: board members, major shareholders, corporate lawyers, financial advisors. Victoria swept in 15 minutes before the scheduled start, Julian at her side. She was wearing red, a power color, her hair and makeup perfect. She looked like a woman who'd already won. She saw me and froze. Her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" I smiled politely. "I'm a shareholder. I have every right to be here." "You own what, 8%? That's nothing. You have no voice in this company." "Actually, Victoria, we need to talk about that." The meeting was called to order. Victoria took her place at the head of the table, Julian beside her. She launched into her presentation about the IPO, about growth and opportunity and maximizing value. She was polished and confident, every inch the CEO. But I could see the cracks. She kept glancing at me, distracted. Julian kept whispering things to her, trying to keep her focused. The board members looked uncomfortable. When Victoria finished her presentation, the chairman of the board, an older gentleman named Harold Whitmore, who'd been one of Dad's closest friends, cleared his throat. "Before we vote on the IPO proposal, there's been a request to address some alternative proposals. Miss Ava Vance has asked for the floor." Victoria's face went from confident to furious in an instant. "Absolutely not. She has no standing here. This is a waste of everyone's time." "Actually," Harold said calmly, "she does have standing, as do several other shareholders who have requested to speak. This is a democratic process, Victoria." I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I'll keep this brief." I walked to the front of the room, Rebecca following with a briefcase full of documents. I looked out at the assembled group, many of whom had known me since I was a child. Some looked curious, others skeptical. A few looked hopeful. 6 months ago, I inherited a broken-down ranch from my father. My sister thought it was a joke. She laughed at me in this very building. She told me I belonged in the dirt with the failures. I paused, letting that sink in. She was wrong about a lot of things, but she was right about one thing. I do belong in the dirt. My mother taught me that's where real things grow. I pulled out the first document. Over the past 4 months, I've been studying Vance Industries. Not because I wanted it, but because I needed to understand what my father built and what's happening to it now. What I found was disturbing. I detailed Victoria's mismanagement, the firings of experienced staff, the risky acquisitions that had already started losing money, the cut corners on safety and environmental compliance that would inevitably lead to lawsuits, the stock price decline. I had numbers, charts, testimony from people who'd left the company rather than participate in what they saw as its destruction. Victoria was on her feet shouting, "This is a hit job. This is slander. You're just jealous because you got nothing and I got the company." I turned to face her directly. "You're right that you got the company, Victoria. Dad gave it to you because you wanted it. But he also trusted you to take care of it, to honor the people who depend on it, to build something lasting. Instead, you've spent 6 months trying to destroy me while the company falls apart." Julian stood up beside Victoria, his voice sharp. "Miss Vance, these accusations are baseless and inappropriate. I suggest we move forward with the vote. I looked at Julian for a long moment. Actually, Mr. Kane, I'm glad you brought up what's appropriate, because I have something to address with you specifically. Rebecca stepped forward and handed me another folder. Julian's face went carefully blank, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. I've learned something interesting recently. Julian Kane has been in communication with Meridian Holdings for the past 8 months. He's been feeding them inside information about Vance Industries' operations strategy and financial status. He's been advising my sister to make decisions that would weaken the company and make it vulnerable to a hostile takeover. He stood to make $20 million if Meridian's acquisition succeeded. The room exploded. Board members shouted questions. Harold Whitmore was pounding his gavel. Victoria stood frozen, her face white as paper. Julian was backing toward the door, but Rebecca had already signaled building security. 2 large men stepped into the room and blocked his exit. "You're lying," Julian said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "You can't prove any of that." "I can, and I will." Rebecca opened her briefcase and began distributing copies of the evidence. Email chains between Julian and Meridian executives. Bank records showing payments to shell companies he controlled. Meeting logs, phone records. It was all there, meticulously documented. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "Julian." He looked at her, and for just a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Because in that moment, she realized that everything she'd believed was a lie. The man she'd loved, the man she'd trusted with everything, had been using her all along. Julian's expression hardened. He pointed at Victoria with contempt. "You were so easy to manipulate, so desperate to prove yourself that you'd do anything I suggested. You're weak, Victoria. You always have been. You got everything handed to you, and you still couldn't handle it." Security escorted Julian from the room. Victoria sank into her chair, shaking. The board members were in chaos, shouting over each other. Harold finally restored order. It took him 5 minutes of gavel pounding and shouting, but eventually people sat down. "Miss Vance," he said, looking at me, "what exactly are you proposing?" I took a breath. "I'm not here to take the company from my sister. My father left it to her, and I respect his wishes. But I am here to save it. I propose the following: the IPO is rejected. Victoria remains as CEO, but under the oversight of a restructured board of directors. I join the board as chairwoman. My father's former executives, people who understand his vision and values, are brought back in advisory roles. We refocus on sustainable growth, ethical practices, and long-term value rather than short-term gains. And we honor the legacy that Arthur Vance built." Victoria looked up at me, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. Her voice cracked. "Why would you do that? Why would you help me after everything I've done to you?" I sat down in the chair beside her. "Because despite everything, you're still my sister. Because Dad believed we could both be better than we've been. And because I'm tired of fighting. The company needs both of us, Victoria. My compassion and your ambition, your drive and my values. That's what Dad wanted. That's what Mom would have wanted." The vote was called. The IPO proposal was rejected unanimously. The board restructuring passed with only 2 dissenting votes. By the end of the meeting, I was chairwoman of Vance Industries, and Victoria was still CEO, but on a much tighter leash. The press went wild. The story had everything: family drama, corporate intrigue, betrayal, redemption. I did exactly 1 interview with Colorado Business Magazine where I kept it simple. This is about honoring my father's legacy and building a company that makes the world better, not just richer. Victoria avoided me for 2 weeks after the meeting. Then one Saturday afternoon, she showed up at Blackwood Ranch. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair in a ponytail. No makeup. I barely recognized her. Caleb was the one who answered the door. He looked at her for a long moment, then called for me. "You've got a visitor." Victoria stood on the porch looking small and lost. "Can we talk?" We walked out to the spot where Mom used to watch the sunsets. The land was beautiful now, transformed by months of work. Green pastures, new fences, the house restored to something warm and welcoming. The barn stood straight and strong. Horses grazed in the distance. We sat on the bench Caleb had built, looking out at the mountains. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Victoria's voice, quiet and broken, cut through the silence. "I'm sorry." 2 words I'd never heard her say, not in my entire life. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see the perfect sister, the golden child, the woman who'd made my life miserable. I saw someone who was hurting and lost and trying to find her way back. "I'm sorry for laughing at you, for treating you like you were less than me, for trying to destroy you when all you did was love Dad and take care of him." She wiped her eyes. "I was so focused on being what I thought I was supposed to be that I forgot how to be a decent person. And I let Julian use me because I was too proud to see what he was really doing." We sat with that for a while. Then I said, "Dad knew we'd end up here. That's why he did what he did. He gave you the company because he wanted you to learn that power without purpose is hollow. And he gave me the ranch because he wanted me to learn that I was worth more than I believed." Victoria nodded slowly. He was always smarter than both of us. Over the next 6 months, Victoria and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. She threw herself into running Vance Industries properly, working with the board instead of against it. She brought back the executives she'd fired and listened to their advice. The company stabilized and then began to grow, but this time in sustainable ways that honored Dad's values. I continued to develop Blackwood Ranch, turning it into a working ranch that provided jobs and education for local families. I expanded the scholarship fund. I started a conservation initiative to protect the land around the lithium deposits. I lived the life Mom would have wanted, the life Dad had trusted me to build. Victoria and I met for dinner once a month, usually at a quiet restaurant in Boulder, halfway between Denver and the ranch. We talked about work, about life, about the past. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments and tears and moments when the old resentments flared up. But we kept showing up. We kept trying. One evening in late spring, almost exactly a year after Dad's death, we drove up to Blackwood Ranch together. We scattered some of Mom's ashes there on the hillside she'd loved. As the sun set over the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple and deep blue, Victoria took my hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I squeezed her hand back. "Thank you for not giving up on yourself." We stood there together, 2 daughters, honoring the legacy of the parents who'd shaped us in different ways. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. Behind us, the ranch house glowed with warm light. Ahead of us, the mountains stood eternal and magnificent. Dad had been right. The real inheritance wasn't the money or the company or the land. It was the choice to be better than our worst impulses, to build instead of destroy, to forgive. Instead of holding grudges, to recognize that true wealth is measured in relationships and purpose and the good we put into the world. I'd learned that the hard way, but I'd learned it. And that lesson, more than anything else my father left me, was the gift that would keep giving for the rest of my life. So here's what I learned from all of this. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who are hurting themselves. Sometimes the things that look worthless hold the greatest value. And sometimes the only way to win is to redefine what winning means. It's not about revenge or proving you're better. It's about being true to who you are and building something that matters. My father understood that. My mother lived it. And now finally I understand it too. What would you do if your family tried to crush you like this? Would you fight back or walk away? Drop your answer in the comments below, and if this story inspired you to think differently about forgiveness, legacy, or family, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about real people facing impossible choices and finding their way through.